Olipa kerran pussikalja, ei kun pussirotta, ei kun Alepan pussirottakalja nimeltä Crash Bandicoot ja hänen arkkivihollisensa tohtori Aivokuori. Tohtori Aivopurkki on luomassa kenraalia, joka johtaa aivopussin joukkoa maailmanvalloitukseen. Mutta voihan sunnuntai Chettar-patonki, koska Crash-pussi pakeni ulos ikkunasta ja tohtori Pussikuski kiukkuisella äänellä sanoo: valmista naarasnauha! Pussikaljarotta herää hietsusta ja hän aikoo päihittää kaikki banaanikuoren pahat pojat ja niin edelleen, kunnes kaljarotta ja pussikuori toisensa kohtaa ja kalja kysyy pussilta, kumpi oli ensin, pussi vai kalja. Mutta ennen kuin tohtori sai kuulla totuuden, hän hävisi taistelun ja putosi kristallikaivokseen ja kysyi Jari Sillanpäältä, missä päin on uloskäynti. 1 vuotta myöhemmin tohtori Rattakettu teki aivokuoripyörteen ja sanoi Kinille: pakotetaan Crash Bandicootia etsimään kaikki 25 mitä ikinä nää on. Crash korvapuusti ja hänen siskonsa Kok oli tietämättömänä kaikesta ja siskoveljelleen sanoi: hakisitko uuden akun? Akun. Mutta voihan muumimamman haiseva pyttipannu, kun Aivonyyman kidnappasi bändin vääntymähuoneeseen ja sanoi: sori siitä äskeisestä, unohdetaan erimielisyydet ja autetaan toisiaan silleen, että sulla ei ole vaihtoehtoja, kiitos. Ja niin perunamuusi meni ja teki mitä tohtori ilkeä Anssikela ei pystynyt tekemään, ja sit Rutto päihitti Anssikelassa. Mutta hän ei tiennytkään mitä jäi tekemättä ja nainen sanoi: se aivovaurio on vielä tuolla. Ja Rutto känni meni hakemaan 100% ja aivovauriota ei ollut enää. Mut kun tohtori Pasianssi tippui ja vapautti ilkeän ja iljettävän ukalahumalan ja ukulele sanoi Pasille: kukaan ei ole uskaltanut pettää suurta ukaukaa, mutta sinä olet pettänyt minut kahdesti. Haluan avioeron. Mut kun se oli bändin syytä, ei se mitään, koska minulla on suunnitelma. Ton käkikellon avulla voidaan aikamatkustella, perua kaikki, jopa tämän videon. Oli
Mitä pitääkö me olla silleen, että hei, tällä kertaa me ollaan Silliksen luona kuvaamassa
ei,
tätä.
Vittu, wow, me ollaan tubettajia.
Älä nyt dimonetaissaa mua tuolla sun sormella. Näissä ei ole sitä ampiaista kyllä yhtään missään. Oh my
Siinä
god!
on mehiläisiä.
Not a beast! Se on niinku joku lapsi, joka pudotti jäätelön maahan.
Seisoo ihan avuttomana siinä.
Äiti! Wow! Mikä saatanan Eloveen mainos on tämä? Siinä se alistaa sitä elefanttia.
Kyllä.
Musta on tosi hienoa, että me voidaan tehdä tekoilulla kuvaa, missä Seppo Taalasmaa on elefantin kanssa samassa kuvassa. Koska sellaista ei ikinä tapahtuisi, niin kuin, tai en mä sano ikinä, mutta todennäköisesti ei tapahdu salkkareissa koskaan.
Jep.
Okei. Mitä pitääkö me olla silleen, että hei, tällä kertaa me ollaan Silliksen luona kuvaamassa
ei,
tätä.
Vittu, wow, me ollaan tubettajia.
Älä nyt dimonetaissaa mua tuolla sun sormella. loppupeleissä ei oo sitä ampiaista kyllä yhtään missään. Oh my
Siinä on
god!
mehiläisiä.
Not a beast! Se on niinku joku lapsi, joka pudotti jäätelön maahan.
Seisoo ihan avuttomana siinä.
Äiti! Wow! Mikä saatanan Eloveen mainos on tämä? Siinä se alistaa sitä elefanttia.
Kyllä.
Musta on tosi hieno, että me voidaan tehdä tekoilulla kuva, missä Seppo Taalasmaa on elefantin kanssa samassa kuvassa, koska sellaista ei ikinä tapahtuisi, niinku, tai en mä sano ikinä, mutta todennäköisesti ei tapahdu salkkareissa koskaan.
Jep.
Okei.
Yrittääkö se soittaa sitä elefantin kärsää niin kuin jotain torvea?
Mikä elefanttia vaivaa, oh my god.
Aika möhkäle. Se käsi on muuttunut kärsää.
sen käsi on elefantin kärsä. Mikä on toi juova tossa noin?
Mikä saatana kusikaari siellä vetää. Tämmöiset kuvat on just siinä rajoilla, että onks tää safe for work vai ei. Niinku tästä ota mitään selvää, mitä tässä tapahtuu edes.
Mitäs sitä tuli tehtyä? Pistit minua persuksiin.
Norsua. Tässä Seppo pistää norsua.
Siinä se nojaa siihen norsuun.
Joo.
Äkkiä, ota kuva. Ai mitä mun takana on? Kärsä, mitä se
Oh no!
Tää ei ainakaan ole safe for work, tää kuva.
Ei mutta ei silloin mitään. Se on
Minkä takia se vetää tuolla jotain mamboa toi hattu päässä?
Vittu kennukke, ei sillä oo mitään haaraa.
Tiedätkö mikä tää on? No. Tää on Suomen juhannus. Ei! Ufot vievät hiukseni! Voi ei!
Yksi pieni elefantti marssi näin, aurinkoista tietäen.
Jesus Christ.
Hyi helvetti! Tää näyttää joltain, tiiäksä, joltain niinku kurssit imankelta, mikä joku on ottanut niinku oikeesti.
Nee.
Joo. Mitäs saatanan katkarapurusetti siellä on päällä?
Sä oot jo pidemmän aikaa kerjännyt verta nenästäsi.
No siinä on.
Sokeria 6 kiloa.
Hulla on päässyt mukaan.
No niin.
Onpa muuten salattujen eläimien näköinen niinku talo. Siis silleen, toi näyttää, tiiäksä,
On
vähän
hyvin samankaltainen kyllä.
se nuuhkasen niin kovaa, että siitä lähtee niinku kermat päältä. Kato, ne lentää tuolla noin.
Aivastaa siihen kakun päälle.
No siinä on. Toi on melkein samannäköinen kuin mun keittiö. Yhtä tommonen työttömän rotan paskanen. Toi.
Luritetaan litku pulloon.
Jaha.
Noniin, hei siinä on Seppo. Gladiaattorina.
Sepon villit seikkailut, et ensin se on jossain savannilla eksynyt norsujen kanssa.
Sä oot kyllä...
Kengänkuva persuksiin.
Toi näyttää joltain Monty Python vitun leffan niinku kohtauksella.
Joo.
Oho!
Joo.
No tälleen nyt ainakaan meinaa hirveesti kettuilis tämmönäköiselle Sepolle.
Give me a kiss.
Auttakaa!
Mikä tää esine on siinä sen vieressä?
No, ilmeestä päätellen joku itsetyydytysväline, joka menee sen... Oho.
Mistä reiästä se tulee se sen pää?
Tässä on hachapuri, eli georgialainen juustoleipä.
Mikä vittu on tämä? Oikeesti. Se on jo hieno kuva, mitä helvettiä. Vittu miten iloinen Seppo. Mad scientist Seppo. Hiivahirviöni on valmis.
Mä olen niin iloinen.
It's me, Seppo Taalasmaa. Ei, tyhmä Seppo, älä purista rottaa, ei.
Kauhea rotta. Tästä lähtee.
Mitä helvettiä tässä?
Tää on se The Thing.
No niin, nyt se on sairaalapeli. Sai jonkun ruton siltä rotalta.
Ei ois kannattanut vittu nuolla niitä rottia, Seppo. Nyt on rutto ja 2 pahempaa.
Hyvästi.
Seppo. Ei kai vaan sun sydän, Seppo.
Vekkuli.
Pakkaa minut heti.
Pahvia.
Piikpaa. Piikpaa. Kappas likkaa kuttu.
Miten se on mahtunut tänne?
Kas niin.
Toi on vitun hyvä kuva. Toi on niinku varmaan vieläkin badass Seppo.
No.
On sen näköinenkin kyllä. Oho.
Se
Vielä
on
vaan
badass.
editoi räjähdyksen tonne sen taakse. Oi.
Kuningas Seppo.
Onko lätkä se jonkin pelikortteihin?
Tee työt ja opi pelaamaan.
Siinä on Seppo Taalasmaa the Third. Hiivan kuningas. Kauhe
Melkoinen
kruunu.
kruunu sille.
Voi perkele, kun tää kruunu painaa enemmän kuin ankkuri.
Sillä on vaan perusarkivaatteen, mutta vaan kauhea kruunu siinä päällä.
En ole enää talotaikuri, minä olen talon kuningas. Miten sä pidät sitä kruunua tolleen päässä?
Oi, nyt ei oo kruunua, mutta on kyllä aika keisarillinen.
On se kruunu tuolla.
Ne olkapäällä.
Se on sen olkapäällä, mutta on muuten vitun hieno kuva. Siis silleen niinkun
Aivan kuten haluatte, ylhäisyys.
Taalasmaa.
Niin.
Oho.
Vähän erilaista pontikkaa tehnyt tällä kertaa myystä muksuille sen.
Siis silloin niinku se sitruunamehun myyntipiste tossa edessä. Eli mikä tossa sen takana sitten on.
Siinä joku koju. Nukketeatteri.
Siinä on nukketeatteri. Mikä vitun bisnesidea? Lemonade stand ja puppet theater. Emglemalala. Hyvä, kun tulla yksi vitun sitruuna tulla pullossa. Yksi kokonainen sitruuna. Before se on vaan laittanut pullon vettä ja sit se on tunkenut sinne yhden sitruunan ja sit se on ollut silleen
Rahantuloa ei voi estää!
ei mene läpi nyt, Seppo. Ei mene läpi. Eikä toi toinen Seppo tulee tuon takaa silleen.
Kun Fish Islands kuva.
Minä olin lentäjän poika.
Niinku.
Tässä on niin paljon näitä suudelmakuvia.
Hei, personal space buddy. Mikä vitun play buttoni sinne tuli? Seuraava kuva.
Tää on varmaan se Seppo Taalasmaa Drowning.
Auttakaa! Tai Seppo haukata liian riisun palan tällä kertaa.
Mä tykkään ajatella, että toi tilanne on ollut semmonen, että se on ollut siellä silleen, kun joku näkee sen, niin se on vaan silleen, juu, ei mitään, ei, joo, menkää vaan. Sitten kun lähtee pois, tulee taas.
Minkä takia sä teet tuolla tämmösen spicy meatballilla tuolla vitun, kun sä huukut?
Tää on melkein niinku jostain Serena-mainoksesta tai jostain.
Ja sä voit laulaa siinä laskiessasi, että antaa mennä kun on alamäki taas.
Mikä kusikaari siinä on taas? Montako Seppoa siellä on hukkumassa?
Ne on Seppo Seireenä ja ne laulaa tuolla jotain miljoona ruusua ja sit kun joku menee niiden luokse, niin ne vaan ottaa sut ja ne vetää sut pinnan alla. Terve meno!
Yrittääkö se puristaa itseään sinne somassa?
Mieluummin tapaa niitten niinku hukuun.
Peltolias vie ihmisen kauheaan turmioon.
Hei Seppo, hyvästi.
No niin!
Hyvä kun ne tulee sieltä yhtäkkiä.
Ja minua!
No se on Sepon näköinen. Itse asiassa aika paljonkin Sepon näköinen. Hyvää työtä tekoäly. Oho.
Tykkää tosta haituvasta sen niinku pään päälle.
Nytkö saa sanoa sen melkoinen sonni?
Kyllä.
Muuten siis...
Tää on aika hyvä.
No tää on aika hyvä kyllä.
Kyllä se on Sanne, Verkonen, Sanne. Kyllä se on Sanne, Verkonen.
Ismo teki mitä?
Tun nuken näköinen toi muksu tuolla taustalla.
Ja se on kyllä.
Seppo on kyllä järkyttänyt. Toi on muuten tosi itsensä näköinen.
Seppo on traumatisoitunut. Tässä on niinku monta Sepon näköistä.
Kaikki Sepot siellä.
Koko sukupaikalla. Kaikilla on samat geenit.
Joo, vittu tulessa itekin. Se on kasuaalisti. Jaha, tää oli tässä. Rauhaa!
Tästä tulee hyvä kuva mun Facebookiin.
Se on oikein ylpeä.
Se on
polttanut sen.
Se on niinku silleen, että minä mä selvisin, niin sit se tajuu, että sen käsi palaa.
Liian confident.
Toi on hieno kuva.
On kyllä.
Onpas lennokkaan näköinen kuva.
Joo.
Onpas tunnelmallinen kuva
Kyllä.
tässä.
Kaikki palhoi.
Albumin kansimateriaalia
Se on yllättävän onnistunut Seppo ottaen huomioon, miten kaukana se on. Ja miten pieni
Niin,
se on.
siihen nähden se on kyllä tosi onnistunut. Plus sitten niinku ylipäätään siis tää kuva itsessään on tosi hieno. Ja niinku, oli tossa sitten ketä tahansa.
Niinpä.
Ja niin sillä on kädet yhdessä silleen.
Mä katsoin sille tää peukalo. Silleen
Se on silleen kassa niin. Poltamme tästä.
Pissa, kakka,
Mitä pitääks me olla silleen, että hei, tällä kertaa me ollaan Silliksen luona kuvaamassa tätä.
Wow, me ollaan tubettajia.
Älä nyt demonetaissaa mua tolla sun
Tässä sitä ollaan vuoden viimeistä päivää ja sinne päin ja morjesta eksyttä paikalle ja tälleen. No mutta voitais helekkarista töitä. Nyt tässä vittu, no en mä tiedä, kun tää vuosikin on niin loppusuoraan, minä on ihan pienläisyksessä, ei siinä. Mä säännän tästä vähän tällä pääruudulla vähän asioita. Näkyy. Joo. Ja tässä etsin tuota skenneä äkkiä ja nyt päästään tänne ruutuun. Joo. Tänään oli suunnilleen vähän niinku puhua tää loppuaika tai tehdä ihan jotakin muuta paskaa tai jotakin. Odotappa. Minä edellä on toi juttu. No ne. No ihan sama. Odotapa. No, mä tiedän. Nyt löytyy. Tuo on vaan tämmöstä pääsallan puolelle. No. No, sanotaan, että se on vaan. Ei. No niin. Nyt mä voin kyllä näyttää miten ton oot syöpyy. Tuolla nyt pitäisi näkyä teiltä tää homma. Kamera ei nyt sori vaan näe, koska se on vähän... No. Voimme se näkkiä programmat tohon noin, niin... Ootas. No, nähdään toisessa skenessä. Nähdään kohta. Noin. No, tota ei voi. Annan ton pieneks. Noin. Noniin. Aika hyvä nimi tai joku huono asettaminen. On vähän niinku vaikka. Se kun zoomaa sitten vielä tuonkin. Siinä näkyy. Ei mitään striimissä. Ei nyt alta nyt tää mitään eikä viikolla kuten ne joku vuoden alusta lähtien. Seuraava vuoden alusta. No, kat vitsi olla välillä turkkiin työkäs. No, kiitos. Tää tämä nyt tehty. Voi vähän lakia tää ruutu. Miksi mulla toi älä naurattua? Sori jätkät vähän... No. Lakaa tää koko paska. Halloo. Mä vähän syytän noita mun töitä. No mä voin olla ne paljon myöhemmin. Odota. Mikä tällä on? No nyt. Tai hetkinen. Ai niinku, joo. Meitä tehtiin hetkeksi. Saa tuupa saipa katkolle ja muut nähdään.
Welcome to the life field, motherfucker!
Isä.
Isänsä kanssa.
Moi, täällä Supernexo Closerilta.
Mitä te odotas? Ei.
Tavataan mun kakapilla.
Huomenta, poika! Isä! Ups, mä unohdin sun eväät. Kukas se muuten oli?
Jukka paska.
Oot puhunittekseen. Mä oon Max. Huomenta. Alkaa nauris jo kypsyyn, mutta jäävät vaan.
Mä aion istua.
Max, sä unohdit sun aseet. Hauskaa koulupäivää.
Vankilaa!
loistavaa lauantai-iltaa sinne tupiin ja tuppakkiin.
Noniin.
Hei, hei. Minä olen Jutta Schneider. En ole nainen. Opiskelijoita Saksassa. Aika hyvä. Pissaa. Minä äänin. Ai. Minä täällä.
Terve. Minä olen Eminem. Olen suomalainen. Olen tulkkija, kääntäjä ja Anssi ja iso.
Vai mitä?
Moi. Tämä ihana mies tässä opiskelee yliopistossa historiaa. Tämä ihana mies tässä on suomalainen. Me asumme yhdessä Tapiolassa.
Kiitos kulta. Minä olen siis Kari Söödä. Söödä. Joskus olen myös interkontinentti. Puhun hyvin ruotsia, englantia, saksaa.
Noniin. Yksi homma vähän kyrpiä, ei löy sitä oikein. Noin ja sitten. No, räpätään YouTubessa sitten joku, no, tää voi koko loppuun asti. Se voi muuta tältä, hei YouTube, ei sinä YouTube, tänne. Kolisio, sori.
Responsive design in CSS is incredibly important, and you may think if you understand media queries, you understand responsive design, but there is so much more to responsive design than just simple media queries. In this video, design than just simple media queries. In this video, I'm going to be covering about 10 different topics on how you can improve your responsive design skills. Some of them are going to be related to media queries, but many of them aren't even using media queries at all. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream projects sooner. And to get started with this video, I'm going to cover some of the more simple concepts, and then towards the end, we're going to talk about some of the more advanced concepts that don't even use media queries at all. Now, the very first responsive design concept you need to understand actually starts in your HTML, and that is this simple meta tag right here for your viewport. If I remove this line of code, my site on mobile is going to look very weird. So right now I'm using a mobile version of my site, as you can see. And if I just remove this line of code and save, you'll see it looks like everything's working just fine, but let's add in some text. Let's just say we're gonna add in a bunch of text. Now you can see that my page scrolls horizontally, which is definitely not ideal. And you've seen websites like this all the time. While if I just come in here and I bring that line back in, add my text in, and I do a save now, you can see all of my text is fitting on the page exactly as I expect. So what this line of code does, I'm essentially breaking it down, is it's saying that the width of your screen should be the same width as your device. So no matter what size my screen is, or what size my phone is, the width of my content is always going to be the same as the width of my device. And this initial scale right here, it tells you what type of zoom level you want to be at when you load in your page for the very first time. So let's change this to 3, for example. And all I'm going to do, just to show what this would look like, is I'm going to toggle off mobile view and then toggle it back on. And now you can see my page is way more zoomed in than before. It's 3 times zoomed in. If I change that back to 1, and then I just do a quick inspect real quick so I can get that back, toggle it off and back on, now you can see I'm back to 1 times zoom. So the reason we put this into our page is to make sure our width is perfect, and we make sure that we're not excessively zoomed in or zoomed out, so it's just defaulting to a normal zoom level. Now the next concept that I want to cover is going to be a concept for media queries. So if we just come down here and I define a media query, and this media query I could say like min width 200 pixels, and then I could change my box to have a background of red. So now you can see, since we're above 200 pixels, the background is red. That's pretty straightforward. Let's change it to like 500 pixels real quick. Now you can see that we have a purple background. And if we just inspect our page, we go back over into that mobile view. There we go. Now we can actually just move this around, and you can see based on my screen size, my box is changing colors. Super straightforward. Everybody understands this. But something that you may not know is you can actually do more than just check widths. For example, you can check orientation inside of here. So if I just type in orientation, I could say landscape. And now whenever I'm in the landscape orientation, so essentially my page is wider than it is tall, you can see the box turns to red, and I could change this to portrait. There we go. And now whenever my height is taller than my width, it's going to be that media query. So this is really useful if you're on like a tablet, or if you're on a phone, you can swap between portrait and landscape, or if you just want to determine which direction is wider, is it wider or is it taller, it's a really useful media query. Another really cool thing you can do is media queries on aspect ratios. So I could say min aspect ratio is like 1:1, for example. And now if I just give this a quick save, when my aspect ratio here is above 1:1, essentially my width is wider than my height. That's what 1:1 is saying. You can see this box has changed to red. I could also do something like 16:9. So once my width expands past that 16:9 ratio, for example, if I really shrink down the height here, you can see the box again changes back to red. Now there's a ton of different stuff you can do in this media query. Another one is like prefers reduced motion. There's a bunch of preferences based on people's like motion preferences or data preferences. Those don't really have to do as much with responsive design, but it's still important to know because it's important to cater your website towards people that want things like high contrast colors or animations or lack thereof. Now the next 3 concepts that I want to talk about are all somewhat experimental with varying levels of browser support. I'll cover all the different browser supports when we get to that point, but the very first one I want to talk about is how you can do ranges with CSS media queries. So normally you would write something like min width 200 pixels, or whatever it is, 300 pixels, and then based on our width, you can see that our box is changing colors. But this is a little bit difficult for me to read personally, so I much prefer to do something along the lines of width is greater than or equal to 300 pixels. That is essentially going to do the exact same thing. Once our width is greater than or equal to 300 pixels, our box is red, and below that our box is purple. But this is much easier to read, so we have the ability to do greater than, equal to, greater than or equal to, we have less than or equal to, and we even have equal to if you really want, but it almost serves no purpose at all. And best of all is you can actually combine these together, so you could say like 100 pixels is less than or equal to our width, and our width is less than or equal to 300. So now when we're between 100 and 300 pixels, you can see our box is that red color, and then when we're less than 100 or above 300, it changes back to purple. Now as for browser support on this, let me just drag this over. As you can see, the browser support is currently 71%, and the only browser we're waiting on here is Safari. All the other browsers support it. So hopefully this will come in relatively soon, but if you don't want to wait, you can use a plugin like PostCSS. They have the ability to do these range syntaxes, and it'll just convert your CSS from the range syntax to the old syntax, and it'll work exactly the same, and it'll work on all browsers. Now the next concept I want to talk about has even better browser support. It's really almost entirely there, and that is container queries, which is one of my favorite new features in CSS. I actually have a full video covering it linked in the cards and description, but I'll give you a really short example of what it is. So let's just come into our code and let's just add in a simple sidebar, and inside that sidebar let's add a box, and we can just get rid of this lorem ipsum text. We don't really need that right now. So what we can do, just expand this out so we can see what we're doing. We can create our sidebar, and for our sidebar let's just give it a width of 20%, and we're going to come in here and we're going to give it a border on the left of 200 pixels. And then we want to make sure that our body here is going to be a display of flex, just so they're going to show up side by side. So we'll just say display flex, just like that. So now our sidebar takes up 20% of the width of our screen, and what we can do is we can just get rid of this mobile view so things are a little bit easier to see. So it'll be a little bit wider, so let's just get rid of that. There we go. and we'll zoom our page out a little bit. There we go. Now let me fix my border here. This should obviously be 1 pixel solid black instead of that 200 pixels. There we go. So now we have our border on the left, or on the, yeah, right there on the left. And let's also give our boxes a little bit of margin so we can just see what they look like. 20 pixels. There we go. So we have a box on the right-hand side and a box on the left-hand side, and you can see that they're pretty big. We'll shrink them down a little bit. Let's do 100 by 100. There we go. Now we have our 2 different boxes inside of our different containers. Also, one last thing that we should probably do is we're going to wrap this normal box inside of some like main container, and then we can just come into our CSS. We can say .main flex grow 1. There we go. Let's just save both of those. And now you can see this box on the left-hand side is filling up a lot of space, and this box on the right-hand side is pushed to the side. We can make our sidebar a little bigger. Let's do like 30%. There we go. So we essentially have our sidebar and our main content. Now this is fine when you just have like one page, but what happens if you want to have a component in your main section, like this purple box, and we want to have a component in our sidebar section, and we want to change this component based on how much space it has? Because if our screen is, for example, you know, really large like this, you can see that we have lots of space on the left, but not too much space on the right. So our media queries would all be for large screen sizes, but this component on the right actually doesn't have that much space. So we want to be able to say how much space does this have inside of its container and size it or change it based on that. So what we're going to do is instead of using a media query, because for example, I could say like media query width is greater than or equal to, let's say 600 pixels. So when we're larger than 600 pixels, our boxes are going to be red. So if we expand this, you can see once we get to this point, our boxes both turn red. Let's say this red styling was like adding additional content. Well, on this right-hand side, there's not enough space for that additional content, but it's still showing up as red in our scenario because our whole page is larger than 600 pixels. Instead, we can change this to an @container query, and this right here is going to say use the container you're inside of to determine your actual width. Then all that we need to do is we need to tell our boxes or our container query what the container is. So we have our main container and our sidebar. These are both our containers, so we can just say that the container type for these is going to be an inline size. And now if I give that a quick save and I change this to something like, let's say 400 pixels, you can see this left-hand section, this main content, is larger than 400 pixels. So it shows up as red, while this box over here is in a container that's less than 400 pixels. So you can see it shows as purple still. And once our entire page shrinks down where the main content is also less than 400 pixels, you can see that changes to purple. This is really useful, especially when you're using like component-based libraries like React. And again, I'd highly recommend you check out the full video of me covering this because there's so much more than just what I'm covering here. Now, as for browser support, it's surprisingly good. You may see this number of 73% and think that's not that great, but if you look here, it's actually supported in every single main browser, and even Firefox just rolled out support for this very recently in the newest version. So just given a little bit of time, maybe a couple months, hopefully this will be, you know, up to like 90% support because it'll be in every browser. You can just see here if we check usage relative, the main thing is like older versions of Safari like iOS aren't quite updated yet, and again some of the Safari and Firefox browsers have not been quite updated to the newest versions. But give it a couple months like I said, and this should be closer to that 90% number and ready for use. Now the last somewhat experimental thing I want to talk about is custom media queries, and unfortunately this one has by far the worst browser support. So let's actually just get rid of all this additional code, just go back to that box that we had before. I'm going to get rid of all of the stuff that we have up here, we don't need any of that, there we go. And let's just make our box perfectly fine, that's how it is, and we'll change this back to a media query. Most often when you're dealing with media queries, you're going to have queries that you repeat everywhere. For example, your width greater than 400 pixels, maybe that's just a size you repeat everywhere in your application. But it's a huge pain to have to, you know, copy this down a bunch of times and write all your media queries like this. Instead, what would be nice is we can just take this and turn it into a variable and reuse it everywhere. And that's the idea behind the @custom media property, where you can define a custom media query, and this will just be able to be used anywhere. So we can say @custom media, then we give it a name, dash, let's just say small, and then we just define what it is. So in our case, width greater than 400 pixels. And then all you need to do is take that variable you've used and pass that in anywhere you have this in your media query. So all the places you use that media query, you would pass this in, and that would give you your media query for this. Now, actually, this should probably be called big instead of large or small. But anyway, there you go. That's how this would work. But of course, there is no browser support at all for this right now. This is currently in stage 2, so it's somewhat stable, and you can use something like PostCSS again, like I've mentioned, to use this live in your site. And if you want to learn how you can do that with PostCSS, I actually have a full video on how to set up PostCSS. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But unfortunately, like I said, this doesn't have any support right now, but I'm really hoping, since this has been in the spec for years, that it'll get adopted by more browsers, because I'm really looking forward to having something like this available. Now that right there is the last media query related thing I want to talk about, and the next few are going to go pretty quickly because they're not too complicated. The first and easiest way to do CSS styling without using a bunch of media queries is to just do different HTML for mobile and different HTML for desktop. This is really only applicable if you have really complex HTML that is drastically different on mobile and on desktop. So like a really complex navigation that has a ton of features on desktop and a little bit simpler navigation on mobile that's also pretty complex. Then what you would do is you would write all your HTML for one and you'd give it a class like mobile only, and you would give your other one a class like desktop only, and then you would just have a really simple media query that's like on the small screen sizes, mobile only is going to be visible, or I guess technically what we would do is on the large screen sizes, we would say display none for mobile, and then on the small screen sizes, we would say display none for the desktop. That's all you would do. So that's the simplest thing that you can do, but in 99% of the cases, you probably shouldn't do that because it's just extra HTML and extra problems that you can have. This is why you want to use some of the tools built into the CSS that allow you to do responsive design without needing a bunch of media queries. The first one I want to talk about is actually going to be CSS grid. This is perfect for doing a bunch of responsive design. So I'm going to come in here, I'm just going to say .grid, whoops, .grid, there we go. I want to move the box inside of there, and I'm actually just going to copy down a bunch of different boxes. There we go. So now we have a bunch of different boxes inside our grid, and you can see that they are on the right-hand side of our screen. I'm going to remove all of this code that we have except for our box. And for our grid, I'm just going to change the display here to grid. Now this won't change anything on our code, but we can set up grid template columns. And let's say that you wanted to have like 3 columns that are going to be all the same size. So you could repeat 3, 1 FR, and there you go. Now you have 3 equal sized columns. Now this is great, but as your screen size changes, maybe you shrink it down, you'll notice it doesn't look super great, or as you grow it really large, it doesn't look super great. So one of the best things that you can do, instead of hard coding a value here for the number you want to repeat, you can make this automatic by saying it's either going to autofill or it's going to auto fit. And these both will automatically determine the number of columns you need to fit exactly the content you want. And to determine the size of your element, you can use a min-max here, where you give it a minimum and a maximum value. So let's say at a minimum, we want this to just be 200 pixels. We never want it to be smaller than 200 pixels. And then we can just say we want it to grow to be any size 1 FR. So now if we give this a quick save, and we'll just change the minimum here actually to 100 pixels. Now all we need to do to get this to actually work properly is just give our grid a width of 100%, because by default it's not taking up the full width of our body, and we'll remove the margin from our body, so we'll just say margin 0 here. Now you can see that all of our boxes are showing up right next to each other. Let's remove the margin from them and remove the hard-coded width, so it'll be automatically determined by the actual container, and then we'll just add some gap into our grid. We'll just say 1 rem. There we go. So now you can see we have our different boxes, and no matter what size my screen is, these boxes are going to grow and shrink in size until they cannot get any smaller, and then it's going to move them to the next line. Or when it grows, it's going to grow until it has room to put a new box on the line. So you can see automatically the containers are determining how many boxes I can put on a row, and this is all with just one single line of CSS. Now the difference between auto-fit and auto-fill is pretty minimal. As you can see, they look pretty much exactly the same, but there is one difference. In order to see that difference, we actually need to remove some of the boxes, because this difference is only determined when the actual width of your container is large enough that you can fit everything in one row. So you can see with autofill, as I change the size of my screen, every time we have space to add a new box or a new column, it's adding that column. As you can see, our boxes are kind of pretending there's invisible boxes there. Now, if we change this to autofit instead, you can see that now we're not adding additional columns beyond what the maximum number of contents we have. So we have 2 boxes, so we'll never have more than 2 columns. That's why they're growing so large. But with autofill, our grid is currently having a bunch of columns right now, like 4 or 5 different columns to fill the entire width of our container. And that just makes sure all of your different elements, even if there's only a few of them, all never become too large. Now, if we just take this back to what we had before with a bunch of different boxes, another really important thing that you need to know about how you can use grid is the ability to do grid auto for the rows and for the columns. In our case, we've defined our columns, so we're going to make our rows automatic, and we're going to say that they're going to be 100 pixels tall. Now we can remove the height from our box, and that height is going to be determined by our auto row right here. So if we change this to like 200 pixels now, you can see every single row that we add to our container is going to be 200 pixels tall, or maybe 50 pixels tall. And every time we add a new row, automatically it's going to be that exact height of 50 pixels, 200 pixels, whatever you define. This is again really important for responsive design because we don't know how many rows we're going to have. It's dependent upon how many different elements we have, as well as how wide or small our screen is. So this allows us to take into account anything possible with how many elements we have and how large our screen is, and make sure it looks exactly like we want, again, without any media queries at all. Now, if you're unfamiliar with CSS Grid, I have a full video covering it. I'll link in the cards and description so you can really deep dive into this concept. Now let's go back to when we just had exactly one box. So let's just get rid of all these additional boxes. We don't need our grid anymore. And we can come in here and I want my box to have a width, 200 pixels, height, 200 pixels, there we go. And we can get rid of all this grid code. Now, one thing you're already probably super familiar with is the ability to do things like a min width. Let's say we want the min width here to be 100 pixels. We'll do a max width, which we're gonna set to 300 pixels. And then you can specify an actual width, which in our case we'll set to, let's say 75% of our screen size. So now what's going to happen is this box is going to be 75% of our screen size until it reaches the max width, which in our case is 300 pixels. Let's make it a little bigger, like 500. So you can see as we expand our screen, once we get to the point where we're at that's 500 pixels, the box never gets bigger. Now when we shrink down our screen, you can see that it's staying at 75% of the width of our screen until we reach our min width, which if we change this to something like 300 pixels, we can see that a little bit better because as you can see here, we're at 300 pixels and now the box is not shrinking down. This is a really common use case for min, max, and normal width, but you can only do this on a few properties, which is why the clamp property is so useful. The clamp property here, what we can do is we can just say our width is going to be equal to that clamp, and our clamp has a minimum value, let's say 300 pixels, an actual value, which in our case is 75%, and then we have a maximum value, which in our case is going to be 500 pixels. And this will do the exact same thing as those min, max, and values and so on. So as we get our screen larger, you can see once we hit 500 pixels, it stops growing. And if we shrink our screen down once we hit 300 pixels, you can see again, it stops shrinking down. That's really important because now we can use this with not just widths, but other things such as font size. And this is really common. You may change your font size based on your actual width of your screen. So here you can set a width value like 1.5 VW, and then you can set a maximum value for your font, like let's say 2 REM, and a minimum is going to be like 0.75 REM. And now your font will always scale between these two values. It will never be smaller or larger. And as your screen size changes, it's going to change the size of your font. So if we just add some font to our page, we can just say Lauren.
No niin. Vois mennä niinku kotiaika kaavelu. Mut ei ihan. No. Vaan kuluttaja. BNB joten nähdään pianissa.
Se on tässä.
Hei! Jee!
Menee vähän pikkusen sähläilemiseksi. Mutta ei vielä näin pitää, katsotaan. Moro. Meinaan hetkeksi.
Se on.
Olipa kerran pussikalja, ei kun pussirotta, ei kun Alepan pussirottakalja nimeltä Crash Bandicoot. Ja hänen arkkivihollisensa tohtori Aivokuori. Tohtori Aivopurkki on luomassa kenraalia, joka johtaa Aivopussin joukkoa maailmanvalloitukseen. Mutta voihan sunnuntai Chettar-patonki, koska Crash-pussi pakeni ulos ikkunasta. Ja tohtori Pussikuski kiukkuisella äänellä sanoo, valmista naarasnauha. Pussikaljarotta herää hietsusta ja hän aikoo päihittää kaikki banaanikuoren pahat pojat ja niin edelleen, kunnes kaljarotta ja pussikuori toisensa kohtaa ja kalja kysyy pussilta, kumpi oli ensin, pussi vai kalja. Mutta ennen kuin tohtori sai kuulla totuuden, hän hävisi taistelun ja putosi kristallikaivokseen ja kysyi Jari Sillanpäältä, missä päin on uloskäynti. 1 vuotta myöhemmin tohtori Rattakettu teki aivokuoripyörteen ja sanoi Kinille, pakotetaan...
Sori. Joku vielä. Otan jonkun matkaa vielä.
Like 100 or something, ton of different font to our page right here. As you can see, when our page size changes, our font size will change as well. Let's make this a little bit bigger, so we'll do like 3.5. We'll make the maximum value like 10, and we'll make the minimum value 0.5, so we can really... see how this changes in size. And also, let's make sure that we move our font size here into our body. So now you can see as my screen size gets smaller, my font size is shrinking down. And as my screen size gets larger, my font size is growing. Obviously, this is way more drastic than you would want to use. You would want to have a much closer maximum and minimum value, and you would want to increase it maybe less than 3.5 VW. But that gives you a concept of how this works, and it's really useful for font size because you can scale off of things like your viewport units. Now, the last concept I want to talk about, I'm actually going to be using a YouTube video I've already recorded. I'll have it linked up in the description and the comments for you. But essentially, I just want to talk about the different types of viewport units, the new ones that are really useful for mobile, because as your mobile screen changes in size, like when you scroll on a page, the URL bar may shrink on your mobile screen. We have different viewports for handling that. So
Sori, katsoin, vähän menee toi laatu vähän huonompaan suuntaan. No. Samannäköinen ohjaaja. On mulla se kohta vielä. Maata vähän saattaa kuusta. Nonni. Vittu on. Mitä vittua on? Mitä vittua? What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?
Haloo?
Terve.
Kuuluuko tää nytte?
Kuuluu.
Hallota. Oletko alasti?
En oo.
Hyvä.
Eikö mä nyt niin sulle tekis?
Uusi suihkuverhochatti, eikö kiva havaajipuita tässä näin tosiaan?
Mäkin oikeesti suoraan hammat.
Nyt.
Maksaa joku 500 €. Ei oo meinaa mitään halppismaskaa. Tokmanilla.
No niin.
Aha. No monni.
Mä mennä se pitää juttu.
Ei.
Mikä tää sauna?
Ei, mulla taisi olla juoma siellä vielä.
Älä käy nyt Uuden alla.
Sauna kiinni.
Oh. Nyt on sauna kiinni.
Katsotaan monnen myöhemmin.
Nauko sydän monta.
Nyt ei tunnu sulla.
Täällä ne puhuu. Nauko on kuulemma tulossa Eeron kadulla.
Pitää...
Tervetuloa saatana.
Pitääkö se lähteä etsimään siellä joku päivä? Kohta päästään nauttimaan naukon seuraan.
Kohta muuten nautitaan.
Ihan kohta.
Kyllä
se reissu kuuntelee.
Saa tulla.
Aveerakin vievi.
Tervetuloa Eeron kadulta vaan.
Tuuko sä mun kanssa nyt suihkuun vaan, laitamme liveä? Siirretään.
Joo, ei ollut. Aina vaan. Hirvettää vähän, että mitä vittua. On ne liiat muut. Katsotaan ihan. Kyllä se kahvi näyttää olevan valmis. Voisin heittää vaikka nyt äkkiä tonne BRB-ruutuun nähdään pian. Joo, eikä eksy kahvia. Tai meinaan hakee kahvia, niin nähdään pian.
Olipa kerran pussikalja, ei kun pussirotta, ei kun Alepan pussirottakalja nimeltä Crash Bandicoot ja hänen arkkivihollisensa tohtori Aivokuori. Tohtori Aivopurkki on luomassa kenraalia, joka johtaa aivopussin joukkoa maailmanvalloitukseen. Mutta voihan sunnuntai Cettar-patonki, koska Crash-pussi pakeni ulos ikkunasta ja tohtori Pussikuski kiukkuisella äänellä sanoo: valmista naarasnauha! Pussikaljarotta herää hietsusta ja hän aikoo päihittää kaikki banaanikuoren pahat pojat ja niin edelleen. Kunnes kaljarotta ja pussikuori toisensa kohtaa ja kalja kysyy pussilta, kumpi oli ensin, pussi vai kalja. Mutta ennen kuin tohtori sai kuulla totuuden, hän hävisi taistelun ja putosi kristallikaivokseen ja kysyi Jari Sillanpäältä, missä päin on uloskäynti. 1 vuotta myöhemmin tohtori Rattakettu teki aivokuoripyörteen ja sanoi Kinille: pakotetaan Crash Bandicootia etsimään kaikki 25 mitä ikinä nää on. Crash korvapuusti ja hänen siskonsa Kok oli tietämättömänä kaikesta ja siskoveljelleen sanoi: hakisitko uuden akun? Akun. Mutta voihan muumimamman haiseva pyttipannu, kun Aivonyyman kidnappasi bändin vääntymähuoneeseen ja sanoi: sori siitä äskeisestä, unohdetaan erimielisyydet ja autetaan toisia silleen, että sulla ei ole vaihtoehtoja, kiitos. Ja niin perunamuussi meni ja teki mitä tohtori ilkeä Anssikela ei pystynyt tekemään, ja sit Rutto päihitti Anssikelassa. Mutta hän ei tiennytkään mitä jäi tekemättä, ja nainen sanoi: se aivovaurio on vielä tuolla. Ja Rutto-känni meni hakemaan 100% ja aivovauriota ei ollut enää. Mut kun tohtori Pasianssi tippui ja vapautti ilkeän ja iljettävän ukalahumalan ja ukulele sanoi Pasille: kukaan ei ole uskaltanut pettää suurta ukaukaa, mutta sinä olet pettänyt minut kahdesti. Haluan avio... Olipa kerran pussikalja, ei kun pussirotta, ei kun Alepan pussirottakalja nimeltä Crash Bandicoot ja hänen arkkivihollisensa tohtori Aivokuori. Tohtori Aivopurkki on luomassa kenraalia, joka johtaa aivopussin joukkoa.
No terve ja muuta verran. No niin. Tää sitten. No, mä lupasin juoda. Nyt muistan avaa eikä ja sitten laittaa uuden vuoden ja kaikkea. On se keep calm and drink coffee and celebrate the new year. Vai mitä? Keep calm, drink coffee, celebrate new year. Eli se on justiinsa tämä. Customer says no to monetization TikTok privacy breach. Project Blocklands, Linux and open source news. Ai vittua. katkaisen tuon mun testiservet anteeksi. No. Kato mitä vittua semmonen. Oi vitu. No mutta. Nyt äkkiä laitan muutelle tän koko paska. No, mulla on tää kaukkari tossa. Nyt äkkiä laitan tää koko helvetin muutelle. Mitä? Joo, nähdään pian.
Olipa kerran pussikalja, ei kun pussirotta, ei kun Alepan pussirottakalja nimeltä Crash Bandicoot ja hänen arkkivihollisensa tohtori Aivokuori. Tohtori Aivopurkki on luomassa kenraalia, joka johtaa Aivopussin joukkoa maailmanvalloitukseen. Mutta voihan sunnuntai Zettar-patonki, koska Crash-pussi pakeni ulos ikkunasta ja tohtori Pussikuski kiukkuisella äänellä sanoo: valmista naarasnauha! Pussikaljarotta herää hietsusta ja hän aikoo päihittää kaikki banaanikuoren pahat pojat ja niin edelleen. Kunnes kaljarotta ja pussikuori toisensa kohtaa ja kalja kysyy pussilta, kumpi oli ensin, pussi vai kalja. Mutta ennen kuin tohtori sai kuulla totuuden, hän hävisi taistelun ja putosi kristallikaivokseen ja kysyi Jari Sillanpäältä, missä päin on uloskäynti. 1 vuotta myöhemmin tohtori Rattakettu teki aivokuoripyörteen ja sanoi Kinille: pakotetaan Crash Bandicootia etsimään kaikki 25 mitä ikinä nää on. Crash korvapuusti ja hänen siskonsa Kok oli tietämättömänä kaikesta ja siskoveljelleen sanoi: hakisitko uuden akun? Akun. Mutta voihan muumimamman haiseva pyttipannu, kun Aivo Nyman kidnappasi bändin vääntymähuoneeseen ja sanoi: sori siitä äskeisestä, unohdetaan erimielisyydet ja autetaan toisiaan silleen, että sulla ei ole vaihtoehtoja, kiitos. Ja niin perunamuussi meni ja teki mitä tohtori ilkeä Anssikela ei pystynyt tekemään, ja sit Rutto päihitti Anssikelassa. Mutta hän ei tiennytkään mitä jäi tekemättä ja nainen sanoi: se aivovaurio on vielä tuolla. Ja Rutto känni meni hakemaan 100% ja aivovauriota ei ollut enää. Mut kun tohtori Pasianssi tippui ja vapautti ilkeän ja iljettävän ukalahumalan ja ukulele sanoi Pasille: kukaan ei ole...
No se oli vitsi. No niin, nyt pitäis kuulla. Tämmöiset bluescreenit itelle. No mutta, tuli vähän perseilyä nyt mun osalta. No. Mitäs sanotaan täällä? Mitä Simplifiedin vanhaa. Tän vuoden muistoksi. Why not? No mutta, tuo oli se mitä mä katoin. Hetkinen. Näin moderaattori. Joo, en vittu tuli katsotaan. Mitä vittu, odottaako vähän? Joo. No mutta. Let's see what is this video. Sorry for the quality, but we know it's my computer issue because I don't have that powerful machine yet. I will have, but I don't have yet. No joo. Without further ado, let's watch this video and I will change the quality of this video. This quality sucks. Almost full HD.
I don't care if you just started learning JavaScript today, or if you've been programming for years, this is something I guarantee you've messed up.
I'm not watching that video. I will be watching the other video. Please take me back. Thank you. This video. This will take some time, or I don't know, but I'm gonna set the timer to my phone when I will publish the
important information in this video. Now with all that out of the way, let's actually get started with this project, and the very first place that I want to start is going to be on the actual server. I want to set up my database for how I'm going to structure my comments, my likes, and so on. What we're going to do is we're going to go over to our server, and we just cd into that folder by saying cd server, and I want to run npm init-y. And that's just going to initialize a package JSON file for us, just like this. And now we need to download the dependencies we're going to use in this project. So I can say npm i --save dev, because these are dev dependencies. And I want to install Prisma and NodeMon. Prisma is what we're going to be using for our database, and NodeMon just allows us to automatically refresh our server every time changes are made. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Prisma, I have a full crash course on it I just released. It's going to be linked in the cards and description for you to check out. Now we can see we have those installed, so I can create a script here called dev start, and that's just going to run nodemon server.js. Oops, just like that. So if I create a file called server.js, whenever I run that dev start script, it's just going to run all the code in our server.js file. Now, the next thing we need to do is actually start working with Prisma. So we need to install the Prisma client so we can use it. So we'll say npm i, and we want to install the @prisma/client. And that's going to allow us to actually use the Prisma code we generate. And now with that installed, all we need to do is actually set up Prisma so we can start working in Prisma. So to do that, we can just run npx prisma init, and that's going to initialize a Prisma project for us. And if you can see over here, we now have this Prisma folder as well as this .env file. So this Prisma folder, we can just expand this here so we can really see what we're working with. This Prisma folder here, we have our schema. This is where all of our information for our models of our database are going to go. And then our env is going to have our URL for our server. So in our case, it's going to be a Postgres URL, and we're just going to change these values. So for my particular database URL, we're going to have this say Postgres here. And the password is just going to be password. And this is running on localhost port 5433. And the database here, I want to call comments, just like that. So this is going to be my own personal URL to a local database running on my computer. You need to already have your database running before you put in the URL here, otherwise it's not going to work. So make sure that you create a database with this particular URL before you put it into your project. Now with that done, we can move over into that Prisma schema file, And if you don't already have the extension for Prisma installed in VS Code, you're going to see a bunch of weird formatting, so just make sure you install this Prisma extension so you get the correct formatting. And with that said, now we can set up all of our different models. So we're going to have a model for a post, because if we go over to this application, you can see we have like a post 1, and we have a post 2, and we can see all the information for that post stuff. So we need to be able to have a model for post, and we need to have a model for the comments that are going to be in those posts. So we're going to have a model for our post, which is going to have an ID. I'm going to be using a string for my IDs, and that's because I'm going to be using a UUID. So our default is going to be a UUID, just like that. Next, I'm going to have a title for our post, which is going to be a string, and we're going to have our body of our post, which is also going to be a string. Pretty straightforward, as you can see. We have a title up here, and we have the body down below it. Now, before we set up our relations for like comments that are inside of our post, I want to set up just all the rest of our default models. So we're going to need a model for our user, because obviously users are going to be the people that are making comments. So our users are also going to have an ID, which I'm just going to copy over the information. They're going to have a name, which is going to be a string, and that's all the information we care about when it comes to a user. Now we can focus on our comment model, and this one's going to be much more complex, because this is where all the complexity of our application lies. So first, inside of here, we're going to have an ID, and I'm just going to, again, copy that ID information down, and we're also going to have a message. That's essentially what your comment is. That's going to be a string. And I also want to put in here a created at and an updated at date. So we could say updated at, and those are both going to be date times. And one interesting thing is, by default, I want this date for created at to be now. So by default, when I create a comment, the created at date is going to be set to the current time. And this updated at, I essentially want to be set every time we change our model. So we can use at updated at, and that's going to automatically update this timestamp every time we make changes to our comment. So that's setting up all that information for us. And now we can actually focus on the more complex parts, which is hooking up all of our different relations between comments, users, and post, and we'll get to likes after that. So our comment is going to have a user that made the comment. So we know we're going to have a user, which is going to have this user type. And if I just click save immediately, it's going to automatically populate a bunch of code for us. As you can see, it added the comment to our user. We can change this to say comments, just to make it a little bit nicer to work with. So each user has multiple comments that they've written. And on our comment, it has a user, which is relating to that by the user ID, which it automatically generated down.
Roolataan toi mun ruutu tonne näytölle nyt. Ja pikku rakuaareihin, anteeksi. Katsotaan mun juttuja. No. Without saying nothing about that. But today we have this, and there is Ultis. Ultis has the stream today, and Tia, the Finnish YouTuber or streamer. No.
The digital health landscape has evolved tremendously as the pandemic ramped up the demand for healthcare and life sciences.
We can use at updated at, and that's going to automatically update this timestamp every time we make changes to our comment. So that's setting up all that information for us. Now we can actually focus on the more complex parts, which is hooking up all of our different relations between comments, users, and post, and we'll get to likes after that. So our comment is going to have a user that made the comment. So we know we're going to have a user, which is going to have this user type. And if I just click save immediately, it's going to automatically populate a bunch of code for us. As you can see, it added the comment to our user. We can change this to say comments, just to make it a little bit nicer to work with. So each user has multiple comments that they have written. And on our comment, it has a user, which is relating to that by the user ID, which it automatically generated down here. We can do the exact same thing with post. So we can say each comment is also going to have a post. Just like this, click a save here, and you can see it auto-populates all that information for us, and up here, we can just change this to say comments, because each post has multiple comments. Now, in order to get the actual nesting portion of our comments to work, we also need comments to have an optional parent ID. So we can come in here and say that we're going to have a parent, and our parent is going to be a comment, but this is optional, because obviously a root comment, such as this comment right here, doesn't have a parent, because it's just a child of the post. It doesn't have a child or a parent comment above it. So we're going to write that in like this. If we click save, it's going to somewhat pre-populate our information, but it's not going to be perfect. So first of all, right here, this should say parent ID instead of comment, just so the name lines up with our actual row right here. and this should say children instead of comments because these are the child comments. Now the next thing you'll notice, if we just put the parent ID into here again, is we're getting an underline here saying there's an error, and the reason there's an error here is because we have two references to this comment table inside of the same table, so we need to give them names so we know what they are referencing. So we can say here, inside of a relation, this is going to be the parent-child relationship. That's the name we're going to give it. And for this comment, it's going to be the exact same relationship. We can say parent-child. So now we've essentially linked these two things together. We're saying, hey, this parent ID right here is pointing to this. So now we've essentially linked these two things together. We're saying, hey, this parent ID right here is pointing to this array of children inside of this comment. And again, if this is something you're confused by, make sure you check out my full Prisma crash course. It'll be linked in the cards and description for you. This is covering all the information about Prisma in there, so that this should be relatively easy to follow. Now, one other thing I want to do real quick is I want to make it so that any time that we delete, for example, a user, it automatically deletes all the user's comments as well. So we can come in here with an on delete, and we can just say we want this to cascade. And what that's saying is anytime that we delete the thing that this points to, which is our user, delete all the comments that that user had as well. Same thing here, if we delete the post, obviously if there's no more post, all the comments for that post no longer matter, so delete all of those comments. And same thing here, if we delete the parent comment, delete all of the children comment inside of that because obviously they have no parent anymore. Now the last model I want to cover is going to be for our likes. So we can just come in here, we can create a model for a like, and a like is really simple. It's just going to be a user and a comment, because a user is going to leave a like on a comment, so those are the only two things we care about. So we have our user, and we're going to have our comment. If we give it a save, it's going to automatically pre-populate all that information for us. Now you will notice we're getting a bunch of errors with this model though, and that's because we don't have an ID. We could come in here and we could, create an ID, but instead of creating an ID, I'm going to create a joint ID because we know that a user ID and a comment ID are always unique because a user can only like a comment one time. There can never be more than one like that has the same user ID and the same comment ID. So we can say that the ID is just going to be a combination of our user ID and our comment ID, and that's going to make it so that it's guaranteed that you can never leave two likes on the same comment if you're the same user. And we also can make sure that we do that on delete cascade for both of these. Because again, if we delete our user or we delete our comment, get rid of all of those likes, they no longer make sense. Now with that done, we can click save, and that's all of the model information for our database done. Creating the actual database model itself is fairly simple because there's only 4 different models, and they all are pretty basic models. The hard part is going to be when we start implementing all of the logic around these models. So now that we have this done, what we can do is we can run npx prisma migrate dev. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a migration on our database that essentially changes our database to look just like this, as you can see here. And it's going to ask us to type in a name for this, so we can just type in a name of a init, for example, because we're initializing our database with all of this information. And now our Postgres database that's on our computer running has tables for a comment, it has tables for a like, and it has tables for users, and so on. So we have all of that information built into our database. I guess one thing I do want to change is I want to change this to say likes instead of like. So I'm going to run another migration. Because I made changes to my schema, I need to create a new migration. So I'm just going to type in that migrate dev again. It's going to run, and now it's just going to make minor changes to have this say likes instead of the capital like it was before. And I think that's going to look a little better. Also, I guess I'm going to do the same thing here with this likes. So I'm just going to run that migrate again one more time just so that those names are consistent across our entire application. And you will notice when I do this migration, it's not actually making me rename my file to a different name. And the reason for that is because changing this doesn't actually change our database itself. It just changes the code that interacts with our database, our JavaScript code. So we don't need to create a new file that runs on our database. That's why it's not asking me for a new file name. So now with all of that done, now we can actually go in and start working on our server. Before we start writing our server code though, there's one other database related thing I want to do, and that is seeding our database. You can actually make it so your database starts with data inside of it by seeding it, and to do that in Prisma is really easy. We can just create a file called seed.js, and in this seed.js file, we can put all of our code for seeding our database. So in our case, all that I've done inside of here is I've just deleted all of our existing data for posts and users. I've created 2 users named Kyle, Sally. I've created 2 posts, which just have a boilerplate post 1 and post 2 title, and some random lorem ipsum text. And then I've created 3 different comments. This is a root comment, and this is a root comment, and then this comment right here is nested inside of one of our root comments, and all of these comments are on post 1. So we have 2 posts and 3 comments and 2 users that we're creating automatically whenever we run this file. Now to hook this up with Prisma so we can automatically run this file, in our package JSON we need to add essentially one section. So we can come in here and we can add a section called Prisma. And inside this Prisma section, we need to add a seed. And all this seed is just going to be a command that we can run. So that command is just node prisma/seed.js. So we're just saying, hey, whenever we seed our database, run this command right here. And this command is just pointing towards that file we just created. So now I can run npx prisma db seed, and what that's going to do is run that prisma seed file we just created because we linked it up right here. We are getting an error though. The reason for that error is we're using the normal import-export syntax that's from ES modules, and by default, Node doesn't support that. You need to tell Node in your package JSON by specifying the type that your type here is going to be module. We're just saying, hey, we're using ES6 modules. You know, that's what we're doing. So now if we rerun this command, hopefully this should work just fine, no problems. As you can see, it says the seed command has been executed. So now all of this information for creating this default data, it's been added into our database. So now at least we have data to play around with in our database. Now in order to run our server, we need to download certain libraries. So we can type in npm I here, and this is going to be for installing our libraries. And we're going to be using Fastify as our server of choice. It's very similar to Express, but when it comes to creating APIs, Fastify just makes it a little bit easier, which is why I prefer it. So we're going to install Fastify. We're also going to install something called .env, which will allow us to pull in environment variables into our project. And then we're going to install essentially a bunch of different plugins to Fastify. So we're going to install @fastify/cookie. That's for dealing with cookies, so we can have user authentication. We're going to do @fastify/cores. This is going to allow us to communicate between our client and our server. And if you're unfamiliar with cores, I have a full video covering exactly what it is. I'll link in the cards and description for you. Also, we're going to have @fastify/sensible, and this just makes it really easy for us to send errors down to our user. So now we can just hit enter, and that's going to install all those different libraries. What we can do in our server.js is actually get started on our project. So in here is where we're going to set up our Fastify application, which if you're familiar with Express is going to look almost identical. So to get started, we can just come in here and we can say we want to import Fastify from Fastify just like this. And then what we can do is we can create an app variable by running that Fastify function. This is identical to Express up to this point. Now to listen, we can say app.listen, and we just need to pass it an object, and this object has a port. And this port here, for example, could be like 3000. Now it's going to run on port 3000. Now I don't want this port to be hard-coded. Instead, I want it to come from an environment variable. So we can say process.env.port. And if we just come up here and we make sure we import .env from .env, and we run that .env.config, this is going to load in everything from our .env file. So if we come in here and we put a port, for example, we just say port 3001, now, when we run our server, it's going to be running on port 3001. And we can test that by saying npm run dev start, which is that command we created in our package JSON that runs our server. As you can see here, we're running a server that's on port 3001. So now what we need to do is just to create a basic get route that's going to return a list of all of our different posts. So to do that, we first need to import the Prisma client that we're going to be using. So this is coming from @prisma/client. We're getting the Prisma client. And then we can get an instance of Prisma, which is just a new Prisma client, just like that. Now with our app, we can say app.get, again, just like Express. And inside of here, we're going to have our path, which is just going to be our root path. Actually, we're going to call this /post, because we're getting all of our post. We're going to have a request and a response. And inside of here, we can use that Prisma client to actually try to access our data. So I'm going to make this asynchronous, because Prisma is asynchronous. And we can await Prisma.post.findMany. And you'll notice that I'm not actually getting any autocomplete for this. So one thing that you can do to fix your autocomplete, hit Control-Shift-P and search for TypeScript. You'll see this TypeScript restart TS server. If you run this, it's going to restart your TypeScript server, which is hopefully going to fix your autocomplete for Prisma. Now you can see I'm getting my autocomplete, so I can say find many, and in here that's going to get all of the different things. So if I passed it nothing for the where clause here, it's going to get all of the different things. We can pass in a select to tell it exactly what columns we want to get. For example, we only care about the ID, so I'm going to say true, give me the ID, and I only care about the title, so I'll say true. The reason for that, if I go back here, is I only list out the title, and then when I click on it, it's going to use the ID to bring me to that exact post over on this side of my screen. I can just expand that out a little bit so it's easier to see. You can see here we're just listing out title, and that's it, and the link from this goes to the ID. Super straightforward. So that's why we're only returning that information. And instead of having to do like a response.send and all that complicated stuff, with this, we can just say return. And it's just going to return the data for us as JSON. So now if we try to go to that URL, which is localhost 3001/post, hit enter, you can see it returns to me that JSON data. So as you can see, we're at localhost 3001/post, and I have an ID for my first post, which is titled post1, and an ID for my second post titled post2. Super straightforward. Now, one thing that's really important when you're dealing with creating an API is actually handling errors. Right now, if this throws an error, we're not actually handling that at all. It's just going to be some complicated error mess that we can't actually process. So I'm going to create a helper function for us. We're going to call this commit to DB, which is just going to take in a promise. And this helper function is going to determine if there's an error in like our Prisma related code. It's going to make sure to handle that error and properly send it down to the user without just like vomiting on our server and doing something weird. This is going to be an async function because we are going to be doing asynchronous code. And inside of Fastify, there's a really handy function called app.to. And this to function is actually a part of that sensible library that we installed. So right now we're not using that sensible library, so we need to import that. So we can come up here, we can say import. That's going to become from Fastify/sensible, just like that. And the library itself is called sensible. Then to use this, we can just come down here and say app.register, and we can register that sensible library. So now we're using that sensible library, and if I come down to here, you can see we now have autocomplete for that to method. And all this to method does is it takes in a promise, some type of asynchronous code, which in our case, this is asynchronous code, and it's going to return to us an error, and it's going to return to us a result. So if we have an error, it gives us an error. If we have a result, it gives us a result. So we're just going to await that, and we're going to say we have our error and our data. So if we have an error, I want to do something. Otherwise, if we don't have an error, I'm just going to return our data down to the user. So if we have an error, instead I want to return app.http errors, which is something that came in that sensible library, and I want to return an internal server error. An internal server error is a 500 error. It essentially means that there's something wrong on the server. All the user information was correct, but our server did something wrong. Like if our database throws an error, it means there's something wrong and we're not really sure what it is. And inside of here, I just want to return the message for our error. So what this is going to do is throw a 500 error from our server, send it down to the user, and it's going to give them the message for that error. So it's really helpful for our user. Then what we can do is we can take this commit to DB, and we're just going to wrap our promise in this. So we can just do this, and now our promise is wrapped inside of that. So what's happening is when we call this function, we're passing down this Prisma code. This Prisma code is running inside of here. If it has an error, it's going to give that error down to the user. Otherwise, it's going to take the data and return that just like normal. So if we refresh over here,
want to know everything about caching, but you're not sure where to start? Check out Reddit.
Data and return that just like normal. So if we refresh over here, and I just expand my page so you can see it, we're still getting the same exact data being returned. But if we had some type of error, like let's just say we put some bad code in here, and now we refresh this, you're going to see, hey, status code 500. That's what I was talking about. That's like that internal server error. Let me just move my camera a little bit. You can see it says error is an internal server error, and the message is saying ASDF is not defined. So it's giving us the message, the status code, and the error. It's all really useful stuff. And that's why I really like using that sensible library inside of Fastify. Let's just bring this back to how we had it before. I'm just going to change that back to true, so we have all of our information working as it was before, and we're getting the correct responses showing up on the right-hand side of our screen. Now I could go ahead and start adding in more methods on our server, but instead what I would like to do is to start working on the client, so at least we have something to look at, because right now just looking at this is really ugly, and I'd like to actually have some UI to look at. So we're going to go over to our client. So I'm going to create a brand new terminal tab. I'm just going to CD into that client folder. So we're actually inside the client folder into here. And I want to install one single library, and this library is called Axios. Axios just makes using the Fetch API in the browser so much easier, which is why we're going to install that library. Now, inside of our client folder, what we can do is we can open up this source folder, and we can run our application. So we can say npm start, and that's going to start up our application. So if you just give it a quick second here, we're going to wait, and it's going to pop up on the right-hand side of our screen. So just a second here, there we go. So now it's loading up, and right now the only thing I have in our app is just the text hello world. So once this is done running, it should just say the text hello world on the right-hand side of our screen. There we go, super straightforward stuff. Now the thing that I want to do next is to start hooking up our application to take the data down from our server. And there's a lot of different ways I could do this. What I want to do is I want to make it as reusable and flexible as possible so we can really easily expand our application. I'm going to create a couple folders here. I want to create a folder called services. This services folder is going to be all the code that deals with calling out to our API. That way all of our API calls are happening in one single folder. So I can create a new file in here. I can call this, for example, posts.js, and now all of our requests for our server that go to a post, such as getting a list of posts or getting an individual post, are going to be in this one single file. I'm also going to make another file in here. This one's going to be called makeRequest.js, and this is going to be the helper function that does all of the requests for us, and all of our other files are going to be really straightforward. So inside of here, we're going to export a function called makeRequest. This is going to take in a URL as well as some options, and this is just going to directly call Axios for us. So we can return calling Axios by saying Axios, and we just pass it in our URL and our options, and then we can just have a really simple .then and a .catch. So our .then is just going to take in our response, and it's going to return our data. So we can say res.data. Our .catch is going to be a little bit more complicated, but not too bad. We're going to have an error, and it's going to take that error. For now, we're just going to save so we can see this a little bit better formatted. What I want to do is I want to return a new promise, which is a rejection. So we're going to reject a promise that is just going to go into our error. So we can say error.response.data.message. And sometimes this error is not going to be populated like we expect, because this is what it's going to look like from our server. But if we have an error on our client, it's going to be slightly different. So we just want to make sure, hey, if we have an error property, then do all this stuff. Otherwise, if we don't, just render out the text error. Just like this. So it's either going to get a custom message or it's just going to have the text error. And that's going to be what this function does. So all this make request function does is it takes our normal Axios request and it breaks it down into two things. If it's successful, it returns the data. If it's an error, it returns us a message. It just makes it a little bit easier to use this promise, since the exact result is going to be our data or our error. This just cleans up that code, because we otherwise would have to do this everywhere in our application. Also, we need to import Axios so we can use it. So I'll say import Axios from Axios. And one other thing I want to do is create a variable called API. The reason I'm creating this variable is because every single request in our application is going to go to localhost 3001/something. We have the same base URL for every single request we make. So we can use axios.create to set some default parameters. For example, we know that our base URL is exactly the same. This is going to come from our .env file. It's going to be called React app server URL. And it's really important, if you're using environment variables in React, they all must start with React _ whatever the name is. Otherwise, it won't work. So now we can create a .env file, just like this. Make sure I move it into the correct folder. There we go. And inside of here, I could say React app server URL, and that's localhost 3001. Make sure I put the HTTP at the front, and that is our URL right there. So now every time we make a request, it's going to use this base URL, as long as I use API here instead of Axios. Also, I'm going to pass with credentials as true, and that's because we're going to be using cookies in order to store our user information. And if you don't have this set, the cookies don't actually go with your request. This is just going to make it when we start implementing user information. This is going to make it so it sends everything correctly. It's going to give the cookie to the server, which is what we want. So now that we have this function written, we can actually use it to create our function for getting our post. So we can say get posts, just like that, and this is going to be a function. And all this is going to do is return make request. We're going to pass in /post. So it's just making a request to that /post URL inside of our server. And the nice thing about this is that's how dead simple this function is. I mean, it does not get much easier than this. That's because we did all the boilerplate code right here, which means we don't have to copy it anywhere else. So now we can create a file, and we're going to put it inside of a folder called components, and it's just going to be called postlist.js. So here, I want to export a function called postlist, and inside this postlist function, for now, we can just return the text that says h1 postlist. In our app, we can render out this post list. There we go. So now if we refresh our page over here, you can see it says post list instead of hello world, which means we're rendering out this component. Now what we can do is we can use a simple use effect, just like this. Make sure I import this at the top of our page from React. There we go. And inside this use effect, I want this to only run the very first time our server starts up, and I want to make a request to that post. So we want to get our post, just like this. And this is going to return to us some data. So we can say .then set posts. So we're going to have some state post set post equals use state, just like that. And by default, I want this to be an empty array. And in here, json.stringify posts. So let's just give it a save real quick and see what happens. You can see it starts out as an empty array, and then nothing happens. We probably have an error. Let me inspect and see if we do. Bring this over, look at our console, and you can see, of course, we have an error. Failed to load, the server responded with a status 404, uncaught promise. So essentially, we're having a 404 error being thrown. It's saying it cannot find that URL. Let's see exactly what URL it's trying to access. We can go to the network tab to do that. And what I want to do is I just want to do a refresh on our page, expand this a little bit so we can see. And you can see, eventually, after a little bit of waiting, we're getting a response and it just says cannot get /post. So there's something going on that is incorrect. The thing that is incorrect is we created this env variable file right here, but we never restarted our server after we created it. You need to restart your React application every time you make changes in this file, otherwise they won't persist. So now when we restart this, give it a second, it's going to refresh our page, and we should see that we're going to get a list of our posts being printed out. And of course, it looks like we're still not getting that list printed out. So if we just inspect our page...
Anteeksi, kun nyt menee rakuareeksi. No nyt se title vastuu. Jatkui.
Let's take a look at what this error is. If we go to our console, it's saying, hey, access to this is not allowed. We're having a CORS error. We need to make sure we implement CORS.
Oh.
This is luckily very easy to do because we're using that CORS library. So if we go into our server, what we want to do is we want to import that CORS library. We'll just call it CORS, and it's coming from fastify/CORS, just like that. And we can say we want to register that CORS library. Register this CORS library. And we want to give it some options as well. These options are going to be the origin. So what URL are we making our request from? This is going to come from an environment variable. We're going to call this our...
Ja sori, jos tää vähän lagaa, niin mulla on huono kone, mutta ei se mitään haittaa. Tai no hei, mä voin hetkeksi koettaa striimi alas. Laittaa laatuasetuksen vähän alemmas, eli peruslukemille, ja sitten pyörii striimiä. No nähdään aivan kohta.